Formula One is an arms race, and we're winning. It's a Fall Out Boy song, you can look it up, or was it Panic at the Disco? But either way, yesterday I found out that Penny Bridge Pioneers by Melancholine is 25 years old, and I'm struggling right now. But speaking of the past, a time that's further away from now than you're willing to accept, there have been several times where Formula One's arms races took incredible leaps to the point where it was a case of, oh my god, they've got this thing that's unlocked so much extra lap time, we need to get on that now. And it's made things go utterly crazy. For starters, there was the winged revolution of the late 1960s, Lotus sticking wings onto the cars to provide them with more grip in the corners, and other teams followed suit. And it wasn't without its dangers, because the teams, especially Lotus, were trying to offset everything with a lighter and stiffer car, so things broke and things went wrong. Those wings were often bolted to the suspension, and in 1968 and 1969 broke off at times, with one such accident happening at the Spanish Grand Prix at Montjuic in 1969. Story goes that Jochen Rindt had his wing fail, causing him to crash. When he got back to the pits, he was apoplectic with rage, supposedly telling his mechanics and Colin Chapman, "If that happens again and I live, I'll kill the lot of you." The same thing happened to his teammate Graham Hill, who would end up having a career-threatening crash at Watkins Glen at the end of the year. And then Rindt would be killed at Monza in 1970, although those accidents weren't necessarily wing-related. Then there was ground effect. Once again, Lotus was the pioneer, even if in this case and with the wings they weren't necessarily the first people to do it. This time, Chapman and team realised that if they created massive tunnels under the car that accelerated air and then they sealed those tunnels off, they didn't need to rely on the topside aero as much, and they could generate downforce or more downforce using the underside of the car instead, something that's come back into Formula One quite recently. But that too had its problems. The cars became much more physically demanding to drive, and the drivers of the time weren't exactly the fittest in the world, with all the smoking and drinking and everything else that came with it. And after a string of massive accidents, including 2 fatal ones in 1982, the FIA saw fit to ban ground effect just to slow the cars down, and allow safety on the cars and the tracks to catch up, and to, have drivers that were actually capable of driving them. So when the 1990s came round, the next big thing was just around the corner. Computers were becoming the new thing that was a must-have in racing. Telemetry was allowing teams to analyse where on track they were losing time, and now they didn't need a driver's first-hand experience to be able to figure out what was going on. They could now see it in real time. Well, more after the fact, because they had to download it from the car before they could actually view it. They couldn't view it live like they can now. But they were still able to see with actual evidence that the car might be moving around in an iffy way in a certain part of the track. Or the drivers could now see with their own eyes how much later he was on throttle compared to a faster teammate. All in, the cars were becoming way more optimised than ever. There's a story of a young Australian engineer called Sam Michael who was working for Mark Larkham's team in Australian touring cars, now V8 supercars. Story goes that he took an off-the-shelf telemetry system that was, available for use at that time that only had a certain resolution, if you want to call it that. It only had a certain amount of points of data, if you follow me. But he then hacked it to be able to get more points of data out of it, and Larkham was able to use that to get a little bit of an advantage. But Sam probably wasn't the only person doing that. By the time 1991 rolled around, Revolution was in the air. Renault had become the engine to have in Formula One as Honda was losing its dominance, and Williams had also signed 2 young engineers who changed the game in 2 different ways. You had Adrian Newey, whose genius is invaluable to anybody who has him on their books, and Fernando Alonso's fans are now clutching pearls that he'll be able to work wonders when he gets proper input on that Aston Martin. And there was also Paddy Lowe, fresh out of university and very talented when it came to all things computers. At the same time, Boeing was working on the 777, the first passenger aircraft to be designed using computer modelling. Once Formula One properly got on board with this, it would mean that things would be put together way more efficiently, and the cars would be way more aerodynamic. On top of this, Ferrari had brought in the flappy paddle sequential gearbox that other teams started to copy once they saw the benefits of it. Faster gear changes, narrower cockpits for aero because they didn't need as much room for the feet, and that sort of thing. Carbon fibre was now a massively integral part of the construction of the cars, and had been since McLaren pioneered all that in the 80s. But with the digital age really being ushered in, there was so much to take advantage of. And in 1992, Williams blew the competition away with the FW15B. But the thing is, the FW14 was, well, how do you describe it? It was proof of concept. It existed just to see if all the gadgets and gizmos that Williams were coming up with were working. Williams had taken the 1991 car, shoehorned in the active suspension, shoehorned the traction control in, and then ran it, just to see if it worked. The FW14B was not actually supposed to run for very long in 1992 before being superseded by the FW15, but because of how utterly bloody dominant the 14B was, they carried on using it. Part of the success of the FW14B was its active suspension. This was something that kind of reversed the effects of the fuel burning off over the course of a Grand Prix. And like how Lotus wasn't necessarily the first to try Venturi tunnels or wings, Williams wasn't the first to try an active suspension system. Ironically, this was something that Lotus tried first, but they couldn't get it to work, probably because the first time they tried it, it was at the end of the 1970s and computers weren't quite there yet. Something more computing power in your Apple Watch than there was on Apollo 11. But in the 1980s they gave it another crack with the Type 92. They had an onboard computer that wasn't just recording bits and bobs for telemetry, as primitive as it was then, but it was also having an effect on the car's dynamics at the same time. Over time, they refined the system at great cost, long hours, and the brains of everybody involved getting cooked. But it didn't arrive properly until 1987 when it was fitted to the 99T, driven by Senna. And despite having an older Honda engine, having the active suspension system meant they could run less wing because of the way the system worked. But by the time Lotus could get something working, any advantage had been lost, because the Williams FW11 had it too, and theirs was better. Frank Durney, who designed the active suspension for Williams, had figured out that if you ran the car's ride height around 1 or 2 millimeters away from what was optimal, you could properly maximise the aerodynamic efficiency of the car. Williams fitted their active system to the FW11B and it won races, although Lotus had beaten Williams to the first win with active suspension tag when Senna won at Monaco and Detroit. But Williams' system was more reactive than active. So how much better was the Williams system? Well, it was lighter than Lotus's for a start, so that's always a good advantage to have, and it was less complicated, and it sapped less power from the Honda engine, which was more powerful than Lotus had to start with since it was brand new, Lotus having to run the 1986 model. The car had to be referred to as having a reactive suspension system because Lotus had trademarked the term active suspension. But since then, active suspension has just become the catch-all term for any car running this sort of thing. And Mansell was initially hesitant to use Durney's suspension setup because he'd used the system in the Lotus 92 and it had tried to kill him on multiple occasions, so he wasn't particularly keen on using it. But as soon as he saw PK using it in testing and going faster, he needed it on his car. How much faster was PK going? Well, he finished a race simulation at Imola with an active car 3 minutes faster than Mansell did with the passive car the previous year. While it had started out as just hydraulics, the system did evolve to use computers later on, because while the non-computerized version was smooth, it handled like crap. But at the end of the 1987 season, Lotus had to ditch their active suspension development because Peter Wall was simply not going to pay for it. Williams, meanwhile, endured 1988 without any wins, so they got rid of it for 1989, 90 and 1991, when it returned on Mansell and Patrese cars in 1992. And like mentioned, the car was so good despite the FW14B not really being designed to have all of that stuff on it. And at the same time, because it was so dominant, it allowed Frank Durney, Adrian Newey, Patrick Head and Paddy Lowe to design the next Williams and have that for 1993 and make sure it was pretty much perfect. That car would be the FW15. The 15 was a clean slate design. Much like how the Brawn car of 2009 had been designed around the controversial double diffuser, the FW15 was designed around the active suspension system. Because the 14B had seen the active suspension retrofitted to the car was largely overweight. So the 15 was designed so that the car would be closer to the minimum weight limit and not be hamstrung by any, extra weight, allowing the power to weight ratios to increase and they could properly unleash that Renault V10 in the back. But like mentioned, the 14B was so good and Mansell had the championship wrapped up by Hungary, this new car was not needed, so it was mostly used as a testing mule throughout 1992. But Williams had to build a new, revised version of the car because the FIA had changed the rules for 1993. The tyres were reduced in width to be 381mm wide as opposed to 457mm wide, and the car's width reduced from 220cm down to 200cm. There was also a change made to the wings, with the rear wing height being reduced from 100cm to 90cm, and then the distance of the front wing end plates from the floor of the car now required to be 40mm minimum apart, if that makes any sense. Oh yeah, there was one other thing that Williams tried to fit to this car. Williams tried something called a continuously variable transmission system, or just simply CVT. I hate these things on real road cars, but at least in more recent times, car manufacturers such as Ford have made them sound like normal gearboxes. I drove a car with a CVT about 10 years ago, and it was just a constant whine, like listening to Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton fans go at it on social media. Here's a picture of one. It looks relatively simple. To put it into simple Billy Basic terminology, it uses a system of belts and pulleys to do some engineering magic so that you have optimal RPM and fuel economy all the time. By doing so, you have all the torque all the time, much like in an electric car. Williams must have been looking for any advantage possible, because they fitted one of these gearboxes to the FW15 and sent it out on a gloomy, rainy runway somewhere in England with David Coulthard behind the wheel to see what it would do. The FIA found out about this test and they banned CVTs immediately. A CVT never raced in Formula 1. It didn't really get to do any more testing beyond that run on that runway. But I've just put it all into Billy Basic language for you because I don't really understand it myself. So if somebody else has done a video on CVTs and the CVT and the Williams, then by all means go and watch that video. I've got it up on Wikipedia over here just to have a look, and I'm like, I've got no clue what any of this means. I mean, what the f*** is a Nissan Cedric? The cube's on there though. I love that car. So the 15B was built to make sure they were testing on a car that would be legal for 1993. No point in testing it on a 1992 compliant car because what would be the point? It might work great on that spec but might be rubbish with 1993 regulations. It meant they could properly fine-tune everything. But if you thought the 15 was an active suspension merchant, it wasn't the only thing that it had. As well as active suspension, it had anti-lock brakes, traction control, two-way telemetry, drive-by-wire controls lifted straight out of an Airbus, pneumatic valve springs, power steering, flappy panel gearbox that could be fully automated, and before the FIA banned it, that's CVT. The FIA banned CVTs because Williams would have most likely decimated the field, because the engine would have run at max power all the time. But at the same time, it's probably for the best, because it would have cost a fortune to continue to develop it. But the biggest improvement had come from the active suspension. They were able to improve on how the 14B system worked, having sensors in the car that sent readings to a computer that then told the car to operate at the correct ride height. But one other thing they were able to do on the 15 family was make the computer react accordingly to how the car was operating in the corners. I'll try to explain it for you now. I might trip up over a few things, so take what I'm saying with a couple of sprinkles of salt. Imagine you're lobbing the car into, I don't know, Cop's Corner at Silverstone. The car will want to roll, so the computer says, I don't want to do that, and it will stiffen up. Similarly, slamming on the brakes for turn 3 at the same track will have the car dive under braking. The computer will say, I don't want to do that, and compensate accordingly. So it was still as much reactive as it was just active. Furthermore, they could now tune the suspension to change for each specific corner on the track if they wanted to do that. The computer would do the rest, and it was all done by distance in between the corners. On the FW14, the drivers had modes that they could select, so they would have one for fast corners, one for slow corners, one for medium corners, and also have one for straights, and then have the ride height fine-tuning. But on the 15, it was mostly automated. It did have some drawbacks though. If anything, Williams had over-engineered the whole thing. Sometimes, the system incorrectly interpreted the sensor data, and if there was air in the hydraulics, that could get the data wrong as well. It was more responsive, but nervous when taken too far, and under heavy braking from high speed, it could be twitchy. Prost did not like a twitchy car. He liked it neutral. He would not drive a loose car at all, and having a loose rear end like Senna liked it was not fun for him. But the ride height bit was also incredibly useful. Too low, you get aero stall and or bottoming out. Too high, you lose aero performance as well. But they did have two extra clever bits on the car. One was an overtake button that simultaneously dropped the rear of the car down and gave the Renault engine another 300 RPM. And this functioned like DRS and push to pass all in one go. The other was if the system detected an imbalance in the car that was not what the computer was set to have, it meant that the car had a puncture, and a light would come on in the cockpit. But this isn't everything to do with the active suspension system, so apologies if I've forgot something. What I try to do in these kinds of situations is give you the Billy Basic stuff and then allow you to go and find out more if you want to, because I'm not an engineer, you're probably not an engineer, but you might want to still find out a little bit more. So if other people have done videos that are more in depth, by all means, go and watch them. So, competitive history then. This was the year of Prost and Damon Hill. Prost in the number 2 and Damon in car number 0, because car number 1 is reserved for the champion and he'd buggered off to IndyCar, so Damon was given 0 and Prost number 2. Damon is actually the second person to have it. Jody Scheckter was the first. But because Alan and Damon had such smooth driving styles, they weren't able to get the most out of the car. The car needed lobbing around to get the most out of it. Mansell, who was a very aggressive driver, could do that and get the most out of it. Patrese, Prost and Hill, not so much because they're too smooth or they're just not used to computer gizmos because they're from a different time. I mean, Prost had just spent 12 months out of Formula 1, so there was a bit of a learning curve for both of them. Prost because, well, he just spent a year out and was brand new to all this stuff, and Damon, even though he was a Williams driver and had experience with the 1992 car, still needed to get his head around it because, well, he was a 32-year-old rookie at the time in his first full Formula 1 season and had been given this stuff to use in a race capacity. But that said, the cars were so quick, they were often qualifying 1.5 to 2 seconds ahead of Schumacher and Senna. And Senna's car was about as advanced on the active suspension front, or more advanced by the end of the season. While Prost won the season opener at Kyalami, Senna won in Brazil after Prost was involved in somebody else's accident. Then there was that race at Donington, where Prost had intermittent gearbox issues and making so many passes through the pits to change tyres. Despite being utterly unstoppable in qualifying, the difference between the FW15C and the rest of the grid was actually less than that of the FW14B and its competitors. McLaren had a car that was just as advanced as Williams, but was underpowered. So with 3 races gone, Senna was an unlikely leader in the championship. He was 12 points ahead of his arch-rival Alain Prost. But Prost and Damon then got the hang of the car, and Williams won 9 of the next 10 races. Prost won at Imola and Barcelona, while Senna took his 6th and final Monaco Grand Prix win. But the dark horse in all of this was Damon, who by now had got the hang of his FW15C and was now challenging Prost for wins and was shadowing him all through the French Grand Prix. He was on course to win at Silverstone before the engine blew up and could have won at Hockenheim as well if not for a puncture. But at Hungary, Hill won. He then won at Spa and won again in Italy, which took points off Prost and allowed Senna to be in contention until the Portuguese Grand Prix, where Prost secured his 4th and final World Championship. But it was the end of an era. The FIA hurriedly banned driver aids except for flappy paddle gearboxes and power steering for 1994, and a lot of people say it did more harm than good, having seen the carnage that we saw over the course of that season, most of it being documented here at one point or another. Williams, who had the most in the way of gizmos and had spent the longest with them, were going to lose out bigly, but as Patrick Head said, it seemed unfair, but you just got on with it. But it's an era that's not been matched since. Cars got traction control back in 2001, or kept it for 1994, keck, but aside from the hybrids, Formula 1 cars haven't had anything like it since these days of the early 90s. Mercedes did a passive version of the collapsing of the rear ride height thing in 2021, but that was done by downforce load, then a button and hydraulics. I've referred to cars as rocket ships, missiles, the USS Enterprise D, but this Williams was like an Airbus, and Prost described it as such. But it does make you wonder, what if they had no cost caps, a very relaxed rulebook, and money was simply no object? What could a modern Formula 1 team come up with? What could Adrian Newey in 2025 come up with? You know that Porsche that they modified and then ragged around the Nürburgring and it just blitzed every lap record in history? Imagine if they took the 2020 Mercedes and did an Evo version of that. I don't know, but I'd like to know what you think. So then, a look at Alain Prost and Damon Hill's FW15C. If this has been a neat little look at an era that will likely never be back, then do give the video a like so I know I did a good job. And for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help with keeping the lights on, then there is a link to Patreon down in the description, along with a link to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and there's memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.